Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I wanted to go into TypeScript and talk about all of the types that you can assign variables and properties to inside of TypeScript, and of course, hence the name of TypeScript, it's one of the main reasons you actually use TypeScript in the first place. So up here at the top we have Mr. Boolean being assigned with let whenever you declare variables. In TypeScript it's recommended you use let instead of JavaScript's var. But we have Mr. Boolean being given the type with the double colon and then Boolean. So that means we're declaring Mr. Boolean as type Boolean. And then we're assigning it the value of true. If you don't already know, Booleans can either be true or false, which is really useful for things like if statements. And then we console log Mr. Boolean out here. So let's go ahead and actually compile and run this code. And you can see I've already set breakpoints. So we'll be able to see all of the outputs as we do console.logs. Let's get started here. So I'm running Webpack just like I was in the previous videos, which in my setup takes the index.ts file and compiles it into bundle.js with a source map so that we can actually debug it. And now we can, actually, let's do it with the debugger. So I'm going to go debug, start debugging. And if you want to know how to get the debugger set up properly, just check my previous video on that. So we have the breakpoint and it hits console log Mr. Boolean. So we would expect this to log out the value of Mr. Boolean. And you can see we can hover over it. And it says currently Mr. Boolean is true. So that's exactly what's going to be logged to the console here. And we do get that value of true. So yeah, once again, true, false, it's really useful for being able to see if something's occurred. Basically the idea of flagging things in your system, like is an operation done? If so, allow it to continue. Next we have Mr. Number, which, well, obviously it's going to be a numeric value, and that can be with or without decimals. So if you are used to some other programming languages, you may be used to having to declare your numbers as a type like integer or long, which is basically a number that can store a really long value because it assigns more space available for that number. But there's also decimal numbers, so that would be something like float variables. And in other programming languages, you would kind of need to declare which specific type of number it's going to be. Because if you declare it as an integer, but you try to assign a float to it, it's going to cut off the decimal points, but not in TypeScript. In TypeScript, basically, any number is fair game. So you can take the same variable and you could assign it an integer, and if you log that out, it's going to give you the integer value, but just as easily you can give it a decimal value, which would generally be a float in other programming languages, and you're still going to get that output as a decimal value. So it really doesn't matter. It just needs to be a number, no strings, or really no quotation marks like down here for the string variables. Should just be a raw number there. Next we have strings. So I have this variable here called Mr. String. Now, if you go into the TypeScript config file, which we're not going to talk about too much in this video, but you can have it set up so that TypeScript, as you're compiling your code, will enforce rules like all strings should be single quoted, which can be useful if you want to be really consistent across your files. But here you can see I can just as easily assign a backtick, a single quote, or a double quote with the same value inside of it to the string. And essentially, in this case, it's the same thing. But yeah, once again, that's all up to you about how much enforcement of common practices you want to have in your files. If you want to be stricter, you go assign things in TypeScript, tsconfig.json, and you get that set up. But here you can use either of those three and they'll all be fine. Now, I didn't actually log this to the console, but if we hover over Mr. String right here, we can see that the latest assignment to that variable with the double quotation marks is the one that's actively working there, but the other ones work too. So next we have Mr. Array, which in this case is being declared as an array of type number. So whenever you have these arrow brackets, you're basically assigning a generic type inside of it. So you could do an array of string here. You could do an array of number, or you could even do, I believe, an array of an enum variable, which we'll talk about in a second. It doesn't really matter. But what an array is, if you don't know already, is it's going to have multiple values stored inside of it, all of the same type. So here you can see in this array of number, we have 3 numbers declared, and they're at different indexes, or indices, whatever. So if you wanted to grab this value right here, you would access the array at index position 0, and then index position 1, and index position 2, so you can store a lot of data in one variable. So just to kind of give you an idea of what that would look like, if you ever wanted to access the data at position 0, you would have those square brackets, and you would say position 0 inside of it. So that means get the array at index 0 and return that value. But if we log out the entire array here with console log Mr. array, what's actually going to occur is it will just output all of the values to the console. So you can see here, it outputs it as an array object, and it's got all of the values inside of it. So at index 0, it's a 4, index 1, it's a 3, index 2, it's a 6. So that's all well and good. Next, kind of like an array, allowing you to store multiple values in one object, you have a tuple. So a tuple, you can see here, it's kind of like an array of different types inside of it. So initially, at the first position, we want to get a string value, and then comma number means at the second position inside of this tuple object, we want, or we expect, a number value. And you can keep going on, making a tuple have pretty much any number of kind of variable values inside of it. And then when you want to declare the tuple, it's an array of those different values. But the difference between a tuple and an array is, A, there's going to be a set number of values in there. An array can go on for as many values as you want, but a tuple is always going to expect the number of values that you actually declared for it. And secondly, inside of the tuple, you can have multiple types of data. So you can have a string and a number rather than in an array where you could just have whatever generic type you have here, like number. So it can be useful. And we log that to the console here. So I'm going to do that. You can see it returns as an array, but it's an array with different types of values. We have both a string and a number. Okay, so next up, enums. So an enum basically is going to map a human readable name. You could kind of think of enums as names to basically its position in the list. And you can actually assign specific number values to enums if you were doing something like, I don't know, HTML response codes. But by default, it goes in numbers by the position, kind of like in an array. So it would be 0 for black like soul, it would be 1 for sparkling sunrise, and it would be 2 for the great beyond, basically representing its position in that list of different enum values. So let's see here. So an enum is being assigned as type Mr. Enum, and we're taking the value black like soul. So that should return the value 0, because that's a default, basically the default value, which is the position in this list. So let's go ahead and see that get output, and we get the value 0. Okay, next up, when you log out, well, if you just assign a variable to the actual enum declaration, and you try to log that out, it's going to give you a list of all the values inside of that enum. So actually, when I was writing this, thought that would work a little bit differently, but it's basically just logging this entire enum declaration out. So you can see, based on its position, it gets assigned a number. But yeah, in reality, there actually is no default enum value, unless you're talking about the default numbers that they're being assigned to for each of these enum names. But whenever you want to assign something to one of those enums, you have to go dot and then the name that you want that assigned to. So moving on, innies, are basically what a JavaScript value would be if you were just writing basic common JavaScript, where because JavaScript is untyped out of the box, any variable can be assigned to any primitive data type or any object. So when you type a variable as any, it's basically saying that it will take anything. It has no requirements there. And honestly, in many cases, it would kind of defeat the purpose of TypeScript, because TypeScript is all about making sure that you're passing the right type of data into your different functions as you write your code. But yeah, you can log that out. If you want to declare it as any, that's fine. It's actually the default type. So if you were using a TypeScript file and you just said let Mr. Any and you didn't actually specify that it was of type any, it would by default be of type any. So let's just go ahead and move past that breakpoint. So you can see it logged Mr. Any, combined it with the string over here, and output this to the console. So it would actually look the same if we didn't put this in quotes, because when Mr. Any gets passed in here and we combine that with a string, it would convert a number to a string anyway. But yeah, you could put whatever you want here and that code would work. Okay, so next up, I have a class declared here. So export class megastructure. And inside of this class, there's 3 property types declared, all typed to different types. So market value is of type string, ultimate move is of type string, and then this one isn't a string, it's of type enum, and you can see we're assigning defaults here. So first one, 4,000 somethings, become a masterpiece, and Mr. Enum, sparkling sunrise. So this works taking the value of the enum that was declared above in the file because it's in the same TypeScript file or JavaScript file. Normally you would do things like import statements to actually pull types from other files, but we're not really focusing on that for now. So anyway, we have this class with some basic defaults, and whenever we wanted to create an object from that class, we would just call the default constructor. And you may notice we don't actually have to define the default constructor. It's just, since it's a class, it's going to have that constructor without us having to write a single line of code. So here in this console log statement, because we're outputting each of the properties individually and combining that with a string, it's going to log the values out as a string to the console, which is probably what you want in most cases. So you can get all of those values, 4,000 somethings, the number 1, which is actually the numeric representation of that enum. So when you actually use enum values, the machine reads it as the number value, not as the human readable name. And then you have become a masterpiece, which is up here as ultimate move. But if we were to just log the object itself, you'd get something more like this. So you can see the object with its type there, and all of the property values listed in sequence. Okay, so the last couple types we need to talk about are void, undefined, and null, which are similar because they basically represent nothingness. So void is a type you can assign to a variable, but you can't assign a variable as type void. So here you can see assigning Mr. Void, which is of type void, to undefined works, because a void expects not to be defined as any actual value, and undefined represents no actual value. And that works, so let's see. And beyond that, we can assign Mr. String or any other type as undefined or null, but we can't assign any other type as void. You can see we get a error here as soon as we try to assign Mr. String to type void. So that's kind of the main difference in practice, but all of them really mean nothing. Like if you assign a function to return type void, it means it's returning nothing. And if you assign a variable to undefined or null, it means that it has no value. So to prove that, let's go down here, continuing with the debugging, to logging out the void value and the null string. So you can see the void variable is set to undefined, so that's what we get as the return value down there. And a null string gets returned as null, but like as far as I'm sure, those are pretty much interchangeable, null and undefined. So I guess one of the minute differences is you could take a variable, like let's say Mr. String there, and you could check if it's an instance of undefined and do something with that. And if that variable was undefined, it would return true. But if it was assigned to null, I believe that would not actually pass it through, and it would be false. Okay, last up in this video, the type of never, which probably is something you're never really going to use. I personally don't see too many practical applications for it, but if you assign a variable the type of never, it means you can't assign anything to it. You can't assign undefined to it. You can't assign a string to it. It's never actually going to be assigned a value in your code. So if that's something you were looking for, that's the type you would use there. But once again, I don't really see much point in using it. Because usually you want variables to have a value so that you can test for things in your code. So that's going to be it for all the types inside of TypeScript. You may see other variables, properties being declared as different object types. Like here you have the megastructure, which I just created on the fly, but really those are just objects, and you'll have a lot of them when you work with different libraries. But as far as the basics go for TypeScript, that's all there is to it. So that's going to be it for this video on TypeScript types. I hope you learned something, and I will have a link down to all the code in this video below, and I will see you guys in my future video content.